7 years ago, I accepted my honors degree facing two empty chairs and a text colder than the champagne at my sister's engagement party. Tonight, they threw a massive family dinner, expecting me to bring a check to save their golden child. Instead, I brought contracts, bank statements, and a truth that left the room in dead silence. By the end of the night, money was no longer what my parents were begging for. My name is Caroline Hamilton. At 22 years old, I had built my entire existence around the quiet, unforgiving architecture of discipline. While other students at Lakeview State University spent their weekends navigating frat parties, football games, and the messy luxury of youth, I was memorizing complex supply chain algorithms under the flickering fluorescent hum of a cheap hotel front desk. I worked the graveyard shift, trading sleep for the meager paycheck that kept a roof over my head. I lived on black coffee and sheer willpower, maintaining the flawless academic record required to keep my full scholarship. On the morning I was set to graduate summa cum laude with a degree in operations analysis, standing in front of a cracked mirror in my cramped dormitory, I felt a rare, fleeting flicker of pride. I thought, just for a moment, that the sheer undeniable weight of this achievement might finally be enough to make my parents look at me and truly see me. Instead, my mother had a conflicting schedule. By a cruel, entirely preventable twist of calendar planning, my college graduation fell on the exact same Saturday as my older sister's engagement party. Sloane Hamilton did not do anything on a small scale, and she certainly did not share the spotlight. Her engagement was not a simple dinner with close friends. It was a grand theatrical production set at an exclusive, wildly expensive vineyard just outside of our hometown of Ashby Ridge, Kentucky. For over 6 months, our mother, Elaine Hamilton, had channeled every ounce of her mental energy, our family's shrinking bank account, and her insatiable need for high society validation into that party. She obsessed over the thread count of the linen napkins, the precise shade of blush for the imported floral arrangements, and the exact placement of the atmospheric lighting. Yet, despite the chaos of Sloane's endless demands, Elaine had promised me. She had looked me in the eye 3 separate times over the holidays and sworn that she and my father, David Hamilton, would be sitting right there in the front row of the university auditorium. She had even called me the Tuesday before the ceremony, sounding like a mother who actually cared. "What color is the graduation gown, sweetheart?" she had asked over the phone, her voice carrying that breathless, distracted pitch it always took on when she was reviewing vendor contracts. "I need to know so I can figure out what to wear. We want to take good pictures. After all, I want everything to be perfect." I had told her the gown was a deep, academic green. I had believed her words. That was my final, pathetic mistake. When the dean called my name, the syllables echoing through the cavernous, packed hall, I stood up. The heavy fabric of the gown swept against my ankles. I walked across the stage, the bright spotlights blinding me for a split second. I extended my hand, shook the dean's hand firmly, and smiled. I smiled the practiced, polite smile of a girl who had spent her whole life making sure she did not take up too much space or cause any trouble. But as I turned to face the massive audience, my eyes bypassed the sea of cheering parents, the waving bouquets of roses, and the flashing camera lenses. My gaze locked entirely onto Section 4, Row A, seats 12 and 13. They were empty, 2 folding chairs, completely vacant, glaringly out of place amid the packed rows of tearful mothers and beaming fathers. My heartbeat did not speed up. My breath did not catch in my throat. Instead, a profound, absolute, freezing stillness settled over my entire body. I held my hard-earned diploma, its leather casing cool against my sweating palm, and walked off the opposite side of the stage. I felt like a ghost haunting my own milestone. I was invisible, even on the day designed specifically to celebrate me. Over an hour later, I stood completely alone in the chaotic, sun-baked asphalt of the stadium parking lot. Whole families swirled around me, laughing loudly, crying happy tears, lifting their graduates off the ground in massive bear hugs. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my dress. I pulled it out, squinting against the harsh afternoon glare. It was a single, brief text message from Elaine. Sloane is too stressed about the caterers running late, and her anxiety is acting up. The glowing screen read, I have to stay with your sister to calm her down. You understand, right? I stared at those specific words. You understand, right? I did not scream into the empty space. I did not hurl the phone across the parking lot. I did not shed a single tear. Crying would imply that a boundary had been violently violated, that a genuine expectation of love had been broken. But standing there among the exhaust fumes and the joyous chatter of strangers, I realized nothing was broken. Something was simply, finally illuminated. A cold truth I had carried deep in my bones since childhood had just been crystallized into one undeniable image of two empty chairs. They did not need me to be happy. They only needed me to be strong. My resilience was not something they admired or nurtured. It was a profound convenience. It meant I required no tending. It meant all the water, all the sunlight, and all the attention could go toward tending Sloane's delicate garden, while I was fully expected to thrive out in the barren drought. I unlocked my battered used car, tossed the leather-bound diploma onto the passenger seat like it was nothing more than an old grocery receipt, and drove away from the university campus. I did not drive back to the house in Ashby Ridge. I drove aimlessly along the winding Kentucky state routes for hours. The windows rolled all the way down, letting the hot, rushing wind strip the lingering, naive hope from my exhausted mind. That afternoon, the desperate girl who constantly craved her parents' approval died quietly behind the steering wheel. I decided right then that I would never again allow my worth to be determined by people who could not even bother to show up. 7 years passed. I did not waste a single day of those 7 years waiting for an apology that would never come. I packed my entire life into 2 large suitcases and left the suffocating, image-obsessed borders of Kentucky for the towering steel and glass canyons of Chicago. I poured every ounce of that relentless, cold discipline into building a life they could not touch. I started at an entry-level position at Halcyon Risk Partners, a corporate risk management firm, and climbed the ladder with ruthless, undeniable efficiency. By the time I reached 29, I was no longer the exhausted girl working the hotel night shift. I was a respected director. I had built a formidable career by identifying flaws in complex systems, and I had recently purchased my own luxury penthouse, high above the chaotic noise of the city streets, using entirely my own money. I kept a deliberate, vast distance from Ashby Ridge. I maintained a polite, sterile boundary. But about 2 weeks ago, a prominent local business magazine ran a feature article highlighting rising female executives in the Midwest. The publication included a professional photograph of me standing on my penthouse terrace. The sweeping, glittering skyline of Chicago spread out behind me like a kingdom I had conquered all by myself. I did not send the article to my family. I did not want their artificial praise. But the internet possesses a relentless way of erasing boundaries, and the photograph inevitably found its way onto Elaine's glowing phone screen. Yesterday morning, my phone lit up with her name. It had been many months since her last brief, highly transactional message. Caroline, sweetheart, the incoming message began. The exclamation point felt like a physical, calculated intrusion. We are all so incredibly proud of the beautiful, successful woman you have become. It has been way too long since we saw your face. I want the whole family to reunite this weekend. We are hosting a special dinner on Saturday night just for us. Please say you will come home. I sat at my sleek, custom oak desk, feeling the soft, mechanical hum of the city vibrating against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and read the message 3 times. The sweetness in her tone was so thick it was suffocating. It was entirely unnatural. My mother did not do spontaneous, loving family reunions, and she certainly did not celebrate my independence. If Elaine Hamilton was setting a grand table and inviting me to sit at it, it meant she desperately needed something carved up and served. I stared at the screen, analyzing the situation with the same cold precision I applied to my corporate contracts. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a warm dinner invitation. This was a carefully constructed stage. They had seen the article. They had seen the expensive tailored suit, the skyline, and the implied wealth of that terrace. They looked at that photograph and saw a shiny, new lifeline for whatever financial crisis Sloane and her husband had inevitably manufactured this time. They believed that because I had always been the quiet, dutiful, dependable one, I would simply walk into their dining room, bask in a few pathetic crumbs of manufactured affection, and obediently open my checkbook. They thought they knew the game. They remembered the 22-year-old girl who drove away in total silence. They thought silence meant surrender. I typed my reply with steady, unshakable fingers. I will be there. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the desk, and turned in my heavy leather chair to look out at the sprawling city. I was going back to Ashby Ridge. But I was not bringing a checkbook or a desperate need for their love. I was returning as the architect of my own life, and I was bringing 7 long years of receipts. Growing up in Ashby Ridge meant learning early on that perception was far more valuable than reality. Our town was the kind of place where neighbors measured your moral failing by the height of your front lawn grass, and where Sunday morning church attendance was a mandatory social performance. In this environment, my mother thrived. Elaine Hamilton was an architect, and her masterpiece was the flawless, radiant image of our family. But that image had a very specific, singular focus. If a stranger were to walk through the heavy oak front door of our house, they would immediately assume I was a distant cousin who occasionally visited, rather than a daughter who lived down the hall. The curved staircase in the foyer was lined with silver-framed photographs, chronicling every conceivable triumph of Sloane Hamilton. There was Sloane in her sequined cheerleading uniform, suspended mid-jump. There was Sloane wearing the shimmering plastic crown as homecoming queen. There was Sloane cutting the ribbon at a local charity bake sale, smiling radiantly for the local newspaper photographer. Meanwhile, my debate team trophies and my state math competition medals were unceremoniously shoved into the bottom drawer of the hallway credenza, buried beneath tangled charging cables and expired takeout menus. My mother never struck me. She never screamed until her throat was raw or threw ceramic plates against the kitchen wall. Her brand of cruelty was far more sophisticated and entirely invisible to the outside world. She had mastered the art of the quiet dismissal. She weaponized expectations. In Elaine's mind, my academic achievements were simply the baseline minimum required of me. When I brought home a report card with straight, flawless grades, she would barely glance at the paper before sliding it across the granite kitchen island, nodding once and saying it was exactly what she expected. Yet, if Sloane managed to pass a remedial biology exam with an average score, my mother would order a customized cake from the expensive bakery downtown and call 3 different aunts to announce the triumphant news as if it were a victory for our entire bloodline. My father was not an evil man, which somehow made his continuous betrayal hurt much worse. David Hamilton worshipped at the altar of domestic peace. He operated under the strict, cowardly philosophy that opposing his wife was a battle he could never win. So he simply stopped suiting up for the war. I grew up with the suffocating realization that my father was kind, but he would never possess the fundamental courage required to choose me. Sometimes, after a particularly blatant display of favoritism from my mother, he would find me sitting alone on the front porch. He would stand beside me, sigh heavily, and pat my shoulder exactly 2 times. He never said the words I needed to hear. He never told my mother she was being unfair. He just offered those 2 pathetic, silent pats on the shoulder, a meager apology for his own complicity, before retreating to the safety of his garage. This dynamic dictated every rhythm of our household. Birthdays were the most glaring metric of our respective values. When Sloane turned 16, my parents rented out the entire local country club. They hired a live band, brought in a massive ice sculpture, and invited 100 people. When I turned 16, 2 years later, I came home from my after-school job to find my parents watching television. My mother handed me a store-bought card with a $20 bill inside and suggested we just order a simple cheese pizza to save money. Citing the overwhelming expenses of Sloane's upcoming college sorority rush wardrobe. While Sloane was the undisputed, radiant center of gravity at our high school, floating from pep rallies to weekend lake parties. I was building a life entirely in the background. I spent my evenings wiping down grease-stained tables and refilling coffee mugs at a local diner, carefully saving my meager tips in a shoebox hidden under my bed. When it came time for college applications, I navigated the labyrinth of financial aid forms entirely alone. I sat at our dining room table at 2 o'clock in the morning, cross-referencing tax documents and writing admission essays, learning the hard way that if I wanted a future, I had to architect it myself without expecting a single ounce of support or guidance. The defining fracture, the moment the hairline crack in our family foundation widened into a gaping chasm, happened during the spring of my senior year. I had just walked to the mailbox and found a thick, heavy envelope from Lakeview State University. My hands were visibly shaking as I tore the expensive paper open. It was an acceptance letter, but more importantly, it was an offer for a massive academic scholarship. It was my ticket out. It was the undeniable, printed proof that my relentless hard work actually meant something tangible. I ran back into the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found my mother in the living room, frantically steaming a silk dress. "Mom, look at this," I said, my voice cracking with an unfamiliar, desperate joy. "Lakeview offered me a full ride. 100% of my tuition is covered." Elaine paused her steaming. She looked at the letter in my hand for exactly 3 seconds. Her expression did not change. There was no sudden gasp of pride, no dropping of the steamer, no rush to embrace me. "That is nice, Caroline. You always were good at taking tests," she said, turning her attention back to the delicate fabric. "Listen, since your tuition is covered, we do not need to worry about those application fees anymore, which is perfect timing. Sloan has her professional portfolio shoot for her modeling agency submissions tomorrow. Can you make sure you are home by 3 o'clock? I need someone to hold the lighting reflectors, and I cannot trust the photographer's assistant to get the angles right." I stood frozen on the living room rug. The heavy envelope in my hand suddenly felt entirely weightless, utterly devoid of meaning. In that exact moment, a chilling clarity washed over me. I finally understood that my greatest triumph was nothing more than a logistical convenience to her. My success was only valuable because it freed up family resources and my personal time to serve my sister's endless ambitions. My achievements would always be firmly tethered to my absolute obligation to serve as Sloan's permanent supporting cast. Yet, despite the overwhelming historical evidence, human nature is a pathetic, stubborn thing. I carried a deeply embarrassing, fragile sliver of hope all the way through my 4 years of college. I told myself that graduating with honors was universally recognized as a monumental life transition. I convinced my rational brain that surely, on the day I put on the academic regalia and received my degree, my parents would be forced to sit in the audience and witness me as a separate, distinct individual. I thought the sheer undeniable optics of a university graduation would override their habitual neglect. That was why their absence at the ceremony was not merely an unfortunate scheduling conflict. It was the final, decisive hammer blow that pulverized the very last fragment of naive trust I held for my family. When that weekend concluded, I did not return to the house in Ashby Ridge to pack my bags in a fit of rage. I did not stand in the kitchen and deliver a tearful, dramatic monologue demanding justice. I simply stopped participating in the delusion. I gathered my belongings over the next few days with a quiet, methodical efficiency. I hugged my father, enduring his standard 2 pats on the back, and I drove away. I built a fortress of distance between us. I stopped answering phone calls immediately. I stopped offering updates on my life. I gave them nothing but silence. Of course, in a town like Ashby Ridge, a family like the Hamiltons could never admit to a failure of love. They could never acknowledge that they had starved a daughter out of their home. So, my mother did what she did best. She rewrote the script. My quiet departure to build an independent life was quickly and skillfully twisted into a narrative of profound betrayal. She spun my absolute silence into a weapon, telling the aunts, the neighbors, and the church choir that little Caroline had grown too arrogant for her hometown. She planted the seed that I had abandoned my loving family out of pure, unadulterated selfishness. They convinced themselves that I was the villain of the story, entirely unaware that their own actions had meticulously written my script year after painful year. I arrived in Chicago with exactly 2 battered suitcases, a checking account hovering dangerously close to empty, and a silent oath that I would never again allow another human being to calculate my worth. The wind coming off Lake Michigan during those first few weeks was brutal, slicing through my thin winter coat, but I welcomed the bite. It kept me awake. It kept me moving. Chicago did not care who my family was, and it did not care about the Hamilton legacy of Ashby Ridge. It only cared about what I could produce. I traded the suffocating, manicured lawns of my childhood for the towering steel grids of a city that felt endlessly cold, yet undeniably fair. I landed an entry-level position at Halcyon Risk Partners, a corporate risk and operations consulting firm. It was the kind of place where junior analysts burned out in 6 months, crushed under the weight of endless data sets and merciless client demands. I thrived there. While my peers complained about the grueling 60-hour work weeks, I found a profound, comforting sanctuary in the spreadsheets. Numbers, unlike my mother, never lied. They never changed their expectations based on their mood, and they never favored someone else. My mind, naturally wired for systems and hypervigilance, made me an asset. I developed a reputation for an obsessive level of patience, tracing every discrepancy down to the absolute final decimal point. I combed through operational liabilities and corporate blind spots with a ruthless precision because identifying risk was the only way I knew how to stay safe. Those early years were a relentless, exhausting grind. I rented a tiny studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building where the radiator clanked violently all night long. My dinners often consisted of whatever was cheapest at the corner bodega, usually a bowl of instant soup eaten standing over my cramped kitchen sink. Every morning, I rode the crowded, screeching elevated train to the financial district, clutching my coffee cup and watching the gray cityscape blur past the scratched windows. It was a profoundly lonely existence. I spent my 20s building my foundation in complete solitude. Yet, as I walked the loud, anonymous pavement, I felt a fierce sense of ownership over my own struggle. Every worn-out shoe sole, every late-night subway ride, and every exhausted sigh belonged entirely to me. Then, nearly 1 full year after I had walked away from my graduation parking lot, the phone rang. I was sitting in my cubicle, staring at a complex risk assessment, when my mother's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it until the phone almost stopped vibrating. When I finally answered, I did not hear the usual crisp, commanding tone of Elaine Hamilton. Instead, I heard a frail, exhausted sigh. "Caroline," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "I did not want to bother you, but I do not know what else to do. It is your father." My stomach plummeted. Despite the ice I had built around my heart, the biological instinct to protect my parent flared instantly. She told me David had suffered a severe back injury while trying to clear a fallen tree branch in the yard. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of him confined to his bed, unable to work, while the medical bills for his recovery piled up on the kitchen counter. Then, she delivered the killing blow. "The property taxes are heavily past due," she whispered, sounding as if she were on the verge of a breakdown. "Between the physical therapy costs and his lost wages, we are drowning." The county sent a final notice. "They are going to foreclose on the house. Caroline, your father is going to lose his home while he cannot even walk." She did not outright ask me for a check. My mother was far too skilled an operator for such a blunt transaction. Instead, she masterfully engineered a suffocating moral trap. She laid the terrifying prospect of my injured father being thrown onto the street right at my feet, making it implicitly clear that any refusal on my part would be a deliberate act of abandonment. If I said no, I was not just protecting my boundaries. I was the villain choosing to let an old, broken man lose the only sanctuary he had ever known. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. I hated the house in Ashby Ridge. I hated the memories it held and the ghosts of my marginalized childhood that haunted its hallways. But I could not stomach the thought of my father, the man who had at least offered me those quiet, pathetic pats on the shoulder, losing his dignity entirely. "How much do you need to stop the foreclosure and cover his immediate care?" I asked, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. She gave me the number. I agreed to set up an automatic wire transfer of $1,350 every single month. I rationalized the decision by telling myself it was a strictly temporary intervention. It was a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, a necessary sacrifice to stabilize my childhood home and ensure my father could afford the basic care he needed to get back on his feet. But a tourniquet left on too long eventually poisons the blood. The monthly transfer quickly became a permanent fixture in my financial reality. I watched a significant portion of my hard-earned salary vanish from my account every 30 days, and soon, the regular payments were no longer enough. The manufactured crises began to multiply with alarming frequency. A few months later, she called to say a severe storm had damaged the roof, and the insurance deductible was impossibly high. I wired an extra $3,000. Then came the frantic call about my father needing a specialized, out-of-pocket medication that their coverage stubbornly refused to authorize. I paid for that, too. There were co-pays for advanced physical therapy sessions, unexpected utility hikes, and property assessment fees. I never mentioned a single word of this financial burden to my colleagues at Halcyon Risk Partners. I never complained to the few acquaintances I occasionally grabbed a drink with after work. I carried the secret like a heavy stone in my pocket. In my twisted, deeply conditioned mind, this was simply the quiet, unglamorous duty of a responsible adult child. I was finally serving a vital purpose. Every time I hit the transfer button, I felt a strange, bitter sense of vindication. Deep down in the darkest corners of my heart, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was doing the very thing they had comprehensively failed to do for me all those years ago. I was showing up when it counted. I was proving that I was dependable, that I could hold the sky up when it was crashing down on them. I was so busy feeling morally superior that I completely missed the fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. The Hamilton family had entered a brand new, highly lucrative era. They had stumbled upon a brilliant operational strategy. They no longer needed to pretend to respect me. They did not need to invite me to holidays, ask about my career, or treat me like a valued member of the family unit to keep me tethered to them. They only needed to manage my guilt. They realized that my fierce independence and my desperate, lingering need to prove my own worth made me the perfect, endlessly renewable resource. I thought I was saving my father from ruin. I thought I was paying a debt to the universe for my own escape. I had no idea that while I was grinding through 60-hour weeks in the cold Chicago winter, eating cheap soup and calculating corporate risk, my own family was quietly building a very efficient, highly customized cash machine. And I was the one keeping it fully stocked. By the time 24 months had passed, the nature of my mother's phone calls underwent a subtle but chilling mutation. The initial tearful pleas and the trembling recitations of my father's supposed medical emergencies vanished completely. In their place emerged a brisk, administrative tone that felt entirely devoid of maternal affection. Elaine no longer asked if I could spare the funds or if my own rent was covered. She simply asked what day the transfer would clear the bank. "The county tax installment is due on the 15th of this month," she would say, skipping any polite greeting the moment I answered the phone. "Make sure the wire is initiated by Tuesday morning so we do not incur those ridiculous late penalties." The lie had stopped being an acute, desperate crisis and had calcified into a fully operational, highly efficient system. I was no longer a savior swooping in to rescue my family from the brink of destruction. I was treated like a recurring utility bill, a guaranteed monthly deposit they factored into their baseline budget. Parallel to this silent, continuous financial bleeding, my sister's life was aggressively and loudly expanding. Sloan married Nolan Pierce in a lavish theatrical ceremony that I deliberately did not attend, citing an inescapable high-stakes project deadline at the firm. Nolan was exactly the kind of man my mother fundamentally adored. He possessed a terrifyingly smooth charm, wore perfectly tailored suits that spoke of generational wealth he did not actually possess, and harbored an insatiable appetite for a lifestyle far beyond his actual earning capacity. He was all glossy exterior and hollow interior, a man who believed that projecting success was the exact same thing as achieving it. Shortly after their extravagant honeymoon, Elaine called to announce that Sloane and Nolan were finally building their long-term future. They were opening a high-end wedding and exclusive event space named Ivory Vale Studio. According to my mother's breathless pitch, it was a guaranteed goldmine, capitalizing on the booming luxury rustic wedding trend. However, they just needed the family to stand firmly behind them during the initial, crucial launch phase to secure their footing in the highly competitive market. It was a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a brutal quarterly audit period at Halcyon Risk Partners, when the trap finally snapped shut. I was running on perhaps 4 hours of sleep, staring blankly at 3 different computer monitors filled with dense liability projections, when an email popped up from Elaine. It was marked with high importance. Attached was a dense, heavily legally worded electronic document. Her text message arrived on my phone a second later. "Caroline, sweetheart, Sloane needs a tiny favor today." The message read, "She is renting some premium audio and lighting equipment for the new studio space. Her credit history is a bit thin right now because she has never had a traditional corporate job. So the equipment vendor just needs a relative to sign a standard character verification form. It is purely an administrative formality. Can you electronically sign it this afternoon? They are threatening to hold the delivery truck." I was entirely exhausted. My eyes burned fiercely from staring at tiny spreadsheet cells since 6 o'clock in the morning. I opened the attached document, scrolled rapidly through the dense, blurry boilerplate text, and saw the digital signature box glowing at the very bottom of the last page. I did not apply my usual, ruthless professional scrutiny. I did not read the fine print detailing the liability clauses. I made the single most catastrophic error of my adult life. I trusted my mother. I clicked the yellow box, typed my full legal name, and hit submit. I did not realize until much later that I had not signed a simple character reference. I had signed a legally binding personal guarantee. With a few careless keystrokes, I had just made my own pristine credit score, my growing assets, and my entire professional future directly liable for a massive portion of Ivory Vale Studios' commercial lease agreements and high-end equipment rentals. For years following that digital signature, Elaine continued to systematically harvest my income, playing me with the cold precision of a master tactician. She kept her fingers firmly pressed on my 2 deepest, most painful psychological vulnerabilities. She exploited the lingering, irrational terror that my childhood home would be seized by the bank and auctioned off. She weaponized the agonizing guilt I felt whenever I imagined my father aging in physical agony and financial misery. David was entirely complicit in this silent extortion. Every few months, usually on a Sunday evening, he would call me. The conversations were agonizingly brief and thick with unspoken tension. "Thank you for the help this month, kiddo," he would mutter into the receiver, his voice betraying a pathetic, cowardly evasion. He never explicitly stated what the money was actually for. He never mentioned the supposed medical bills, the physical therapy, or the property taxes. He fully embraced the role of the vague, ignorant beneficiary because playing dumb was infinitely easier than turning to his domineering wife and demanding she explain the math. He chose his own domestic peace over my financial security. Meanwhile, the visual, undeniable evidence of my financial sacrifice was broadcasted daily across the internet. Sloane's social media feeds were an endless, nauseating parade of excess and vanity. There were countless high-resolution photographs of her wearing designer silk dresses, clinking crystal champagne flutes at Ivory Vale Studios' glamorous launch parties, and showcasing perfectly curated, impossibly expensive floral installations imported from overseas. I would sit on the crowded, screeching train in my practical worn wool coat, scrolling through images of my sister living a life of absolute, unbothered luxury, and feel a sharp, acidic twist of resentment in my stomach. Yet, I violently forced down the rising suspicion. I gaslighted my own instincts. I stared at my reflection in the dark subway window and told myself that all families were inherently complicated. I reasoned that medical debt was a private, messy affair that did not always look like poverty on the outside, and that Sloane's lavish business expenses had absolutely nothing to do with the heavy sums of cash I was wiring to keep a roof over my aging parents' heads. But illusions, no matter how desperately you cling to them, cannot withstand the corrosive, illuminating power of hard data forever. By the end of the 6th year, I pulled my banking history to prepare for a major real estate purchase. I tallied the outgoing wires over the life of the arrangement. I had sent a staggering total of $106,900 directly to the Ashby Ridge accounts. Most normal people would look at that massive, life-altering figure and feel only blind, uncontrollable rage. They would scream, throw things, and demand immediate repayment. But my mind did not work that way anymore. Years of grueling work at Halcyon had completely rewired my brain's response to crisis. The sheer, terrifying volume of the money ceased to be an emotional, heavy burden of a guilty daughter. It suddenly transformed into something entirely different, something cold and clinical. It became a data set. My ultimate danger to my family did not stem from the vast amount of money they had successfully drained from me. It stemmed from the fact that I finally stopped looking at the situation like a desperate child trying to buy her parents' elusive affection. I started looking at it like a senior operations risk analyst staring at a fraudulent, highly suspicious corporate ledger. The numbers were entirely too consistent. The fabricated emergencies were too perfectly timed to match Sloane's business expansions. The financial math simply did not align with the tragic narrative Elaine was aggressively selling. And once I saw the undeniable pattern in the numbers, I knew with absolute, chilling certainty that I had to dismantle and decode the entire machine. By then, I had built a secure life in Chicago and was finally doing well enough to believe my family could no longer touch me. Around that time, I started dating Noah Whitaker, a sharp commercial litigator who quickly noticed how completely my mother could still unravel me. The glittering surface of my newly established life began to fracture exactly 6 months after I moved into the penthouse. It started as a minor, easily dismissible annoyance. I received a sterile, automated piece of mail from a commercial leasing conglomerate, claiming I owed a series of administrative late fees. I assumed it was a careless clerical error, a simple case of mistaken identity, and tossed it onto my kitchen island. But 30 days later, a second letter arrived. This one was sent via certified mail, printed on heavy legal stock, and its tone was unmistakably hostile. It was a formal warning of an impending default on a massive commercial equipment lease. My blood ran completely cold. I stared at the account number referenced in the letter, my mind desperately trying to connect the jagged pieces. Then, the memory hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The electronic document. The Tuesday afternoon I was exhausted from an audit. The supposed character verification form my mother had desperately needed me to sign, so Sloane could secure audio equipment for Ivory Vale Studio. I did not panic. I did exactly what I was trained to do at work. I brought the problem to a specialized expert. I handed the certified letter and a digital copy of the original document I had signed to Noah as we sat in my living room. I watched his face closely as he read the file on his tablet. The relaxed, affectionate warmth in his eyes completely evaporated, replaced by the hardened, merciless gaze of a litigator staring at a financial disaster. He did not speak for several long minutes. When he finally looked up at me, the grim expression on his face made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. "Caroline," Noah said, his voice deadly serious and stripped of any comforting inflection, "you did not sign a character reference. You signed a full, unconditional personal guarantee. You are legally responsible for every single piece of equipment they rented, and judging by the cross-collateralization clauses buried deep in page 14, you might be directly liable for a massive portion of their commercial property lease as well." I sat frozen on my expensive leather sofa, unable to draw a full breath. A guarantee. My mother had handed me a loaded gun in the dark and told me it was a flashlight. If Sloan and Nolan defaulted on their glamorous business venture, the creditors would not just take back the lighting rigs and the soundboards. They would come for my personal bank accounts. They would come for the penthouse. A messy, public financial judgment could instantly destroy my professional standing at Halcyon, where my entire career was built on advising corporations on how to strictly avoid catastrophic risk. The life I had painstakingly built brick by brick was suddenly standing on a massive, expanding sinkhole. The next morning, the magazine feature about my promotion reached Kentucky, and Elaine called with a syrupy invitation to a family dinner. The timing confirmed everything Sloan and Nolan were drowning, and they wanted access to my name, credit, and assets. I told her I would come the dining table in my penthouse, usually a pristine slab of white marble, vanished beneath a mountain of paper. For 3 days and 3 nights, my apartment transformed into a war room. Noah sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his tablet glowing as he navigated the clunky, outdated public record databases of my home county. We did not sleep. We drank black coffee and fed cold data into a massive spreadsheet, cross-referencing every single wire transfer, every desperate text message, and every frantic email my mother had ever sent me. I treated my own life like a hostile corporate audit, and the deeper we dug into the sediment of my family history, the more toxic the groundwater became. First, we pulled the property tax assessments for the house in Ashby Ridge. I braced myself to see the delinquent notices my mother had sobbed over all those years ago. Instead, the screen displayed a flawless payment history. The taxes had never been late. There was no lien, no penalty, and absolutely no threat of foreclosure recorded on the county ledger during the year my father injured his back. Noah then utilized his legal access to pull state labor board filings. He found the workers' compensation claim my father had submitted after the accident. The documents clearly outlined that my father's employer had covered nearly the entirety of his medical rehabilitation costs, and he had been receiving a steady, bi-weekly check for temporary income replacement. The terrifying narrative of my parents losing everything and ending up on the street was a complete, calculated fabrication. There had never been a financial emergency. There had only been an opportunity. We moved on to the money. I had printed out 7 years of my personal bank statements, using a yellow highlighter to mark every single outgoing transfer to my mother's account. Beside it, Noah pulled up the incorporation timeline and public vendor histories for Ivory Vale Studio, along with an archive of my sister's boastful social media posts. We aligned the dates. The results were sickeningly precise. In late October of my 3rd year in Chicago, my mother had begged for an emergency wire of $4,500, claiming the house urgently needed a new furnace before the winter freeze. 3 days after my transfer cleared, Sloan posted a photograph of herself signing the commercial lease for the event space, thanking her family for their generous seed capital. In April of the following year, Elaine demanded $2,000 for my father's supposedly uncovered physical therapy sessions. Exactly 48 hours later, Ivory Vale Studio proudly announced the arrival of 20 custom-built, high-end farm tables. The $3,000 I sent for roof repairs magically coincided with the installation of illuminated exterior signage. The $5,000 I wired for an unexpected property assessment perfectly matched the exact week Sloan hired a luxury branding agency for a stylized photo shoot. Every single drop of my panicked, guilt-ridden labor had been funneled directly into financing Sloan's delusions of grandeur. "It gets worse," Noah said quietly, his eyes fixed on a freshly downloaded document from the state secretary. "Look at the corporate registration amendments for the studio." He turned the screen toward me. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they locked onto a specific schedule of organization. My name was listed right there in black and white. They had not just tricked me into signing a commercial lease guarantee, they had formally registered me as an advisory member of their limited liability company in an amended filing. I had never attended a meeting. I had never received a distribution, and I had never been briefed on a single operational decision. They had simply grafted my pristine financial reputation onto their sinking ship to make it look seaworthy to creditors. The financial betrayal was monumental, but the final, most devastating blow came the next morning, entirely by accident. We needed a certified copy of a specific lien filing, so I called the county records office. The clerk who answered happened to be my younger cousin, May Holloway. May was always a bit of a gossip, and hearing my voice after so many years opened a floodgate. "Caroline, oh my goodness, I cannot believe you are calling," May whispered into the phone, clearly trying to hide her voice from her supervisor. "Everyone is talking about you coming to the big dinner on Saturday. Aunt Elaine has been calling the whole family all week." "What exactly is she telling them?" "May?" I asked, keeping my tone light, casual, and completely unthreatening. May hesitated. Then the secret spilled out. She confessed that for years, my mother had been carefully constructing a narrative among the extended family that I had abandoned them out of pure arrogance. Elaine told everyone who would listen that I despised my small-town roots and only threw a little bit of money at them whenever it was convenient, just to assuage my own selfish guilt. "Aunt Elaine was actually bragging to my mother just yesterday," May continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She said they were going to ask you to officially take over the studio's debt consolidation. My mom asked what would happen if you said no, and Aunt Elaine just laughed. She said you would never dare refuse her in front of a house full of relatives. She said you are too obsessed with looking like the good, successful daughter, and that you owe them anyway for running off to the city." My mother had not invited the family to celebrate me. She had invited an audience to trap me. She intended to leverage social pressure, relying on my deeply ingrained childhood terror of causing a public scene, to force me into signing away the rest of my financial future. "Thank you, May. I look forward to seeing everyone," I said, my voice steady and cold as a glacier. Before disconnecting the call, I sat at the table and began to compile the data. I did not just print the documents. I curated them. I went out and purchased a thick black leather binder. Inside, I created a ruthless, undeniable chronological timeline. I placed the highlighted bank statements side by side with the fraudulent text messages Elaine had sent to justify the requests. I included the worker compensation payouts next to her pleas for medical money. I matched the transfer dates to Sloane's lavish receipts. I printed the commercial lease guarantee, the misleading explanation my mother used to secure my signature, the state business filings, and the late payment warnings. I tabulated the exact sum of $106,900 on the very first page, printed in a large, bold font. Noah watched me assemble the binder with a mixture of awe and profound concern. He offered to represent me formally, to draft the cease and desist letters himself. I politely declined. I loved him, but I needed a ruthless litigator who had absolutely zero emotional connection to me. That afternoon, I hired a shark from a separate downtown corporate law firm to handle the liability extraction. We initiated the preliminary steps to aggressively separate my name from Ivory Vale Studio, citing fraudulent misrepresentation. Before I packed my overnight bag for the drive to Kentucky, I logged into my banking portal. I navigated to the recurring transfers page. I stared at the automated command that had quietly siphoned my livelihood for the better part of a decade. With a single click of the mouse, I permanently canceled the monthly wire to Elaine Hamilton. I zipped my bag and picked up the heavy black binder. My mother had spent her entire life directing a flawless, fictional play where she was the martyr and I was the obedient, silent extra. Now, she wanted to stage a grand finale in front of the whole town. I decided I was more than happy to give her the stage, but I was bringing my own script. The drive from Chicago to Ashby Ridge took just under 6 hours, but the heavy silence inside the car made it feel like an eternity. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the towering skyscrapers gradually melted into the sprawling, flat farmlands of the Midwest, and finally into the rolling green hills of Kentucky. I did not turn on the radio. I did not speak. Resting heavily on my lap was the thick, black leather binder, its smooth surface cold beneath my fingertips. Noah kept his hands steady on the steering wheel. Glancing at me occasionally, he understood the profound weight of this return. Just as we crossed the county line, he reached over and placed his hand gently over mine. "Remember your objective tonight, Caroline," Noah said, his voice calm and anchored. "You are not walking into that house to win a screaming match. You are not there to demand an apology they are entirely incapable of giving. You are simply there to terminate a predatory system. Keep your emotions completely detached. Let the data do the heavy lifting." I nodded once, taking a slow, deep breath. "I know. The ledger is closed." When Noah turned the car onto the familiar tree-lined street of my childhood, the first clear sign of the ambush materialized. I had expected a tense, intimate gathering of 4 or 5 people. Instead, the entire curb was choked with vehicles. There were at least a dozen cars parked haphazardly along the street and crowding my parents' driveway. I recognized my aunt's silver sedan, the local real estate broker's luxury SUV, and the dark blue truck belonging to a prominent town council member. Elaine had not merely invited the immediate family. She had summoned an entire congregation. She had packed the jury box with every gossiping neighbor and influential relative in Ashby Ridge. Noah parked 2 blocks away to find an empty spot. As we walked up the concrete path toward the heavy oak front door, my pulse remained steady. The terrified, desperate girl who used to crave validation in this house was dead. In her place stood a woman holding a comprehensive audit of her own exploitation. We stepped inside, and the overwhelming scent of roasted rosemary and expensive red wine hit me instantly. The house was vibrating with loud, overlapping conversations. In the main living room, the heavy oak dining table had been artificially extended with multiple wooden leaves, stretching awkwardly into the parlor to accommodate nearly 20 guests. But the most grotesque detail hung directly above the brick fireplace. It was a large, beautifully calligraphed banner, draped elegantly over the mantel, bearing the words, "Family Carey's Family." It was a sickeningly sweet, fabricated moral slogan designed to look like a heartwarming mantra. But to me, it read exactly like a ransom note. Before I could even take off my coat, the crowd parted. Elaine descended upon me. She wore a pristine emerald green dress and a flawlessly practiced expression of overwhelming maternal joy. She threw her arms around me, hugging me so tightly that I could feel the sharp edges of her diamond rings digging into my spine. "Look who finally made it home," Elaine announced, her voice projecting loudly enough to guarantee that every single person in the room stopped talking and turned to watch. Our beautiful, successful girl. The absolute pride of the Hamilton family. A chorus of warm murmurs and polite applause rippled through the guests. To the uninitiated observer, it was a beautiful, touching portrait of a mother welcoming her beloved daughter back into the fold, but I felt the rigid, calculating tension in her shoulders. It was a performance, and the opening act was designed to publicly establish our unbreakable bond before she asked for the money. I pulled away gently, plastering a polite, entirely hollow smile on my face. I introduced Noah, watching as my mother expertly appraised his expensive watch and tailored suit, calculating his net worth in a fraction of a second. I scanned the room, identifying the other key players in this theatrical production. Sloane was standing near the kitchen island, gripping a crystal glass of white wine with white-knuckled intensity. The glamorous, carefree facade she aggressively projected on social media was completely absent, up close, without the benefit of perfect lighting and digital editing. My sister looked hollowed out. There were deep purple shadows under her eyes, and her smile was dangerously brittle. Beside her stood Nolan, holding a tumbler of amber bourbon. Unlike his wife, Nolan looked incredibly relaxed. He offered me a charming, easygoing wave, wearing the serene, infuriating confidence of a man who firmly believed he was untouchable. He was absolutely certain that the golden goose had just walked through the front door, ready to obediently clear his disastrous debts. Then, I located my father. David was hovering near the hallway entrance, keeping a safe distance from the center of attention. When my eyes locked onto his, he flinched. He immediately dropped his gaze to the hardwood floor, suddenly fascinated by his own shoes. He did not approach me. He did not offer a hug. His avoidance was a glaring neon sign. My father might not know the exact numerical details of the trap waiting for me, but he absolutely knew the floor was heavily mined, and he had once again chosen the path of cowardly silence. The dinner commenced shortly after. Noah and I were seated near the head of the table, directly to my mother's right. The meal was a grueling endurance test of forced pleasantries. Silverware clinked against fine china, while aunts and family friends bombarded me with invasive questions about the Chicago real estate market and my corporate title. Every single inquiry felt like a tactical probe to assess my liquidity. I answered with smooth, noncommittal diplomacy. I did not touch the roasted beef on my plate. I simply drank ice water and waited, letting the suffocating, heavy atmosphere of the room wrap around the guests. The storm finally broke just as the dessert plates were being cleared away. The ambient chatter naturally died down as Elaine gracefully picked up her silver spoon and tapped it lightly against her wine glass. A bright, ringing sound cut through the room. Absolute silence fell over the long table. Elaine stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress, her eyes shining with manufactured emotion. She began with a flowery monologue about the passing of time, the enduring strength of roots, and the profound blessing of having everyone gathered under one roof. Then, she seamlessly pivoted the spotlight directly onto me. "We are all so incredibly amazed by the woman Caroline has become," Elaine said, her voice trembling with perfect, theatrical pitch. "She left this small town, built a massive career, and conquered the city. But what truly makes a mother proud is not the title or the penthouse. It is the heart. What makes me proudest is that despite her wild success, Caroline has always remained grounded. She is someone who truly understands that at the end of the day, you must always put your family first." The trap was wide open. I could feel the collective gaze of 20 people locking onto my face. Noah shifted slightly in his chair beside me, a silent anchor in the rising tide. Elaine raised her crystal glass high into the air. "Tonight is not just a reunion. It is a celebration of resilience and new beginnings. As some of you may know, Sloan and Nolan have encountered a few unfair, unexpected market hurdles with their beautiful studio recently, but that is exactly what family is for. We carry each other. And I am beyond thrilled to announce to all of you tonight that our brilliant Caroline has graciously agreed to step in and help her sister navigate this temporary difficult period. With Caroline firmly backing them, Ivory Vale is going to restructure, overcome these hurdles, and launch an even grander second chapter." The entire dining room erupted into spontaneous, joyful applause. My cousin cheered. An elderly aunt dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin. At the other end of the table, Nolan raised his bourbon glass directly at me in a smug, victorious salute, while Sloan let out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. I sat perfectly still in my chair, the applause echoing in my ears like static. This was the razor's edge. This was the exact psychological checkmate my mother had spent her life perfecting. If I reacted according to basic human instinct, if I shouted, if I denied it, or if I stormed away from the table, I would instantly become the villain. The room would view me as the greedy, heartless corporate executive who publicly humiliated her desperate family over a few dollars. Elaine would remain the tragic, loving matriarch trying to hold her children together. But my right hand was already resting securely on the brass zipper of the heavy black briefcase sitting on the floor beside my chair. They wanted a show. They wanted a captive audience. I realized right then that my mother had made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed I still cared about the script she had written for me. The applause rang out, loud and enthusiastic, bouncing off the walls of the crowded dining room. I let the sound wash over me for exactly 10 seconds. I let them clap for the beautiful, heartwarming illusion my mother had just painted. Then, I placed my hands on the edge of the table and pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The harsh, abrasive noise sliced right through the cheering. One by one, the clapping hands slowed and dropped into laps. The polite smiles faltered. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down in a fit of rage. I reached down to the floor. grasped the handle of my briefcase and pulled out the thick, black leather binder. It was heavy, packed tight with years of forensic financial evidence. I lifted it high enough for everyone at the table to see before I dropped it dead center on the pristine white tablecloth. It hit the wood underneath with a loud, authoritative smack. A crystal salt shaker toppled over. The entire room went dead silent. "My mother is absolutely right about one thing," I said, keeping my tone flat and detached. "Family does carry family. And I have been carrying this one with my bank accounts, my legal signature, and my financial stability for a very long time." I reached over and flipped the heavy cover of the binder open to the very first page. "To be exact, I have carried this family to the tune of $106,900. I paused, letting the massive sum hang heavily in the air above the roasted beef and the expensive wine. I saw my elderly aunt's jaw actually drop. My cousin May swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward my mother. Nobody moved to speak. I had completely bypassed their emotional defenses by leading with a staggering, irrefutable data point. "Let us review the accounting," I instructed, turning to the first heavily tabbed section. During my 3rd year in Chicago, I received a frantic phone call. I was told my father had suffered a catastrophic back injury, and because of his mounting medical bills, this very house was facing immediate foreclosure. I agreed to wire $1,350 every single month to prevent my parents from becoming homeless. I held up a thick stack of bank statements, the highlighted lines glowing under the dining room chandelier. Then, I placed a certified county document right next to it. However, according to the official county tax ledger, the property taxes on this estate have never once been delinquent. Furthermore, State Labor Board records confirm my father's physical rehabilitation was entirely covered by worker compensation, and he received a steady income replacement check for the entire duration of his recovery. The emergency never existed. I turned the page. The sound of the crisp paper flipping was incredibly loud in the frozen room. "So, where did my money actually go?" I tracked the timeline. I looked directly at my sister. The perfectly applied makeup could no longer hide her absolute paralyzing terror. 3 days after my mother begged for $4,500 to replace a supposedly broken winter furnace, Sloan signed the expensive commercial lease for Ivory Vale Studio. When my mother demanded $2,000 to cover my father's denied medications, 20 custom-built luxury farm tables arrived at the event space exactly 48 hours later. When I wired $3,000 to fix a roof damaged by a storm, the studio miraculously unveiled its custom illuminated signage. I looked around the table, making deliberate, unblinking eye contact with the town council member and the gossiping neighbors. I was never keeping a roof over my sick father's head. I was silently bankrolling my sister's collapsing business fantasy. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Sloane's face drained of all color. She stared at the tablecloth, her hands trembling violently. "But cash was not enough," I continued, turning to the thickest section at the back of the binder. 3 years ago, my mother urgently emailed me a document. She claimed it was a standard character reference required by an equipment vendor because Sloan had a thin credit file. I was working a grueling 90-hour week. I made the mistake of trusting my mother, and I signed it. I pulled out the printed contract, holding it up by the corner. It was not a character reference. It was an unconditional personal guarantee. My mother tricked me into legally co-signing a massive commercial liability. Today, because Sloan and Nolan are defaulting on their business loans, my penthouse, my pristine credit score, and my professional reputation are all under direct threat from their creditors. Nolan suddenly pushed his chair back, holding up his hands in a fake, placating gesture. He tried to deploy his slick salesman routine, though a bead of sweat was visibly dripping down his temple. "Now hold on just a minute, Caroline," Nolan interrupted, his voice dripping with forced calm. "That was strictly a procedural misunderstanding. The leasing office sent the wrong boilerplate form. Nobody in this house was trying to trick you into anything." I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the back pocket of the binder, pulled out a sealed, heavy legal envelope, and slid it directly across the table until it hit his water glass. That is a formal liability extraction brief drafted by my corporate litigation attorney, I told him, watching the fake confidence melt completely off his face. It details the exact timeline of the misrepresentation, the amended corporate filings that illegally listed me as an advisory member without my consent, and the specific cross-collateralization clauses you fully intended to exploit. Do not insult my intelligence by calling calculated fraud a clerical error. Nolan opened the envelope with shaking fingers, scanned the first paragraph of the legal threat, and snapped his mouth shut. He shrank back into his chair, entirely neutralized, seeing her golden son-in-law crushed and her entire lifelong narrative burning to the ground. My mother panicked. She slammed her palms flat against the table. Her face was flushed dark red with frantic, desperate rage. "How dare you?" Elaine hissed, abandoning her sweet matriarch persona completely. "How dare you come into my home and humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of outsiders? You are turning a private family struggle into a public spectacle just to make yourself look superior." I looked calmly into her wild, furious eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. "I did not make this a public spectacle, Mother," I replied, my voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy air. "You are the one who hung the banner. You are the one who invited the audience. I am simply providing them with the correct script." The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and devastating. The gravitational pull of the entire room had violently inverted. The aunts, the cousins, and the wealthy neighbors were no longer looking at me with polite expectation or thinly veiled judgment. They were staring at Elaine, Sloane, and Nolan with wide, horrified eyes. The grand, flawless illusion of the perfect Hamilton family had been shattered into a million jagged pieces right on top of the dinner plates. Instead of seeing me as the cruel, wealthy daughter who coldly refused to throw a lifeline to her drowning sister, the entire room finally saw my family for exactly what they were: perpetrators caught red-handed in the middle of a theatrical extortion plot they had built themselves. The heavy silence following my mother's outburst was not peaceful. It was the suffocating, highly pressurized quiet of a room where oxygen was rapidly running out. No one dared to pick up a fork. No one reached for their wine. The guests simply stared, their eyes darting nervously between my mother's furious, flushed face and the massive black binder sitting in front of me like an unexploded bomb. Then, from the far end of the table, a chair scraped backward. It was my cousin May. "Aunt Elaine," May started, her voice shaking so badly it echoed off the dining room walls. "You told me Caroline abandoned you. You sat in my kitchen just last month and swore to me that she never called, never came home, and only threw pennies at you because she wanted to buy a clear conscience." My mother whipped her head toward May, her eyes wide with panic. "May, do not get involved in this. You do not understand the pressure of raising a family. She told me the exact same thing," another voice interrupted. It was my mother's older sister, sitting directly across from Noah. Her wrinkled hands were gripping the edge of the white tablecloth. "Elaine, you called me crying on Christmas Eve 3 years ago. You said Caroline had become so obsessed with her corporate promotions that she looked down on us. You said she treated you like dirt. You made us all believe she was a heartless monster while you were secretly draining her bank accounts." The collective realization swept through the room like a cold draft. This was not a simple misunderstanding between a mother and daughter. This was a deliberate, highly calculated smear campaign. Elaine had actively poisoned my reputation to ensure that no one in the family would ever reach out to me and accidentally uncover her lucrative financial pipeline. Sloane, who had been sitting frozen in her chair, suddenly placed her hands flat on the table. She looked physically ill. She turned her head, staring at the timeline I had laid out. "I did not know," Sloane whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked from the binder up to my face, her eyes welling with tears. "Caroline, I swear to you, I did not know. Mom told me she had secured a private angel investor. She said the seed money was a small business grant. I never would have taken a single dime if I knew it was your rent money or your savings. I looked at my sister. For the very first time in my life, I did not see the golden child, the flawless homecoming queen, or the arrogant bride. I saw a pawn. I believe that you did not know the origin of the initial cash flow. Sloan, I said evenly. But you absolutely knew the math of your own business did not add up. You knew your lifestyle was not sustainable. You just chose not to ask the hard questions because the answers would have forced you to close your studio. Sloan opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the chance. I reached into the binder and pulled out a fresh stack of stapled papers. They were not bank statements. They were official county court records. And your studio did not just fail because the luxury event market experienced a sudden downturn, did it, Nolan? I asked, turning my attention directly to my brother-in-law. Nolan visibly flinched. The smug, untouchable aura he had worn all evening completely vanished. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Caroline, keep my business out of this," Nolan warned, his voice dropping into a desperate, aggressive growl. I ignored him and read directly from the highlighted legal docket. According to civil court filings from just 2 months ago, Nolan Pierce is currently being sued by 3 separate event vendors and 2 private clients. The lawsuit alleges that Nolan deliberately took massive, non-refundable cash deposits from engaged couples for future weddings, and instead of holding those funds in escrow, he illegally funneled that money to pay off his own mounting personal debts and overdue contractor invoices from previous events. A sharp gasp escaped Sloane's lips. She whipped her head around to stare at her husband. What did she just say? You told me those couples canceled their contracts because of scheduling conflicts. Sloane, baby, listen to me, Nolan stammered, reaching out to grab her arm. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. I was going to move the money back as soon as the spring bookings cleared. I just needed to buy us some time. Your mother said Caroline was going to co-sign the restructuring loan tonight, and it would all go away. Sloane jerked her arm away from him as if his touch burned her skin. The horrifying reality crashed down on her all at once. She was not just the oblivious beneficiary of her mother's extortion. She was also the blind victim of her own husband's massive financial fraud. Her perfect marriage, her glamorous business, and her entire public identity were built entirely on stolen money and lies. She pushed her chair back, covering her mouth with her hand, completely unable to speak. The destruction of their pristine facade was absolute. The room was in ruins. And then, from the dark shadows of the hallway entrance, a voice broke the tension. Enough, it was my father. David Hamilton walked slowly into the dining room. He looked 10 years older than when I had arrived. His shoulders were slumped, and he could barely lift his eyes from the floor. He walked over to my mother, standing slightly behind her chair, but he did not offer her a comforting hand. David, tell her, Elaine pleaded, grabbing his sleeve. Tell Caroline that we had to do it. Tell her it was the only way to keep the family together. My father slowly pulled his arm out of her grasp. He looked at me, and the deep sorrow in his eyes was instantly suffocating. I am sorry, Caroline, my father said, his voice cracking with heavy, cowardly shame. I should have stopped it. Stopped what, Dad? I asked, though my chest suddenly felt tight. Stopped her from stealing from me, or stopped her from lying to you. He closed his eyes. I knew. The words hung in the air, heavier than any court document or bank statement. I knew by the 2nd year, my father confessed, looking down at his worn shoes. I saw the bank statements. I knew my medical bills were fully covered by insurance. I knew the money you were sending every single month was not paying for the house. I asked your mother about it once. She told me that Sloane was drowning, that her business was failing before it even started. Elaine said if we did not use your money to prop Sloane up, she would lose everything, and the whole family would completely collapse under the scandal. He finally looked up, meeting my gaze with profound, pathetic weakness. I let her do it. I let her take your hard-earned money because I was too tired to fight her, and because I wanted to keep the peace in this house. I thought you were strong enough to handle the loss. Caroline, I thought you would be fine. Of all the revelations that night, this was the single hardest blow. My mother's cruelty was a known variable. Nolan's greed was predictable. But my father's confession shattered the very last illusion I carried. For my entire life, I had convinced myself that David Hamilton was simply a gentle, beaten-down man who was a victim of his wife's domineering personality. I had justified sending the money because I believed I was protecting him. Now, I understood the devastating truth. He was not manipulated. He had seen the reality of the extortion, evaluated the situation, and consciously decided to sacrifice me to keep his own life comfortable. He had used my resilience as a weapon against me. You thought I was strong enough to be robbed, I summarized quietly. The last tether binding me to this family snapped cleanly in two. Elaine, realizing that her husband had just destroyed her final line of defense, completely unraveled, she burst into violent, theatrical tears. She collapsed forward, resting her head on the table, sobbing loudly. "I did it for the family," she cried out, her voice muffled by the tablecloth. "Everything I did to protect my girls. I wanted Sloane to have a beautiful life. I wanted us to be happy. You have so much. Caroline. You have the big city, the fancy job, the money. Why could you not just share it? Why do you have to be so cruel and destroy us?" Her tears were real, but they were not tears of remorse. They were the tears of a control freak who had just lost her grip on the steering wheel. She genuinely believed that her manipulation was a form of maternal love, and that my refusal to be bled dry was an act of unforgivable cruelty. The moral scale of the room had completely flipped. There was no longer any ambiguity. Sloane sat entirely disillusioned, staring at the ruins of her fake life. Nolan was exposed as a desperate fraud. My father stood paralyzed by his own admitted complicity, and Elaine was weeping over the death of her own lies. For the first time in 29 years, I did not have to second-guess my reality. I did not have to wonder if I was being too sensitive, too selfish, or too cold. I looked at the wreckage around the dining table, and I felt absolutely, undeniably justified. The heavy, suffocating weight of my father's confession and my mother's theatrical weeping hung over the ruined dining table. I watched Elaine sob into her linen napkin, entirely consumed by the violent collapse of her own dictatorial control. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. I reached into the very back pocket of the black leather binder and withdrew one final, thick manila envelope. I dropped it onto the white tablecloth right next to the mountain of financial evidence. The dull, heavy thud made my mother flinch and look up, her expensive makeup running down her flushed cheeks in dark, jagged lines. "While you are mourning the end of your perfect illusion, we need to finalize the actual paperwork," I announced, my voice cutting through the humid, tense air like a finely sharpened scalpel. "Inside that envelope is a formal notification from my legal counsel. We have officially initiated the legal extraction process to sever my name, my credit, and my assets from every single guarantee attached to Ivory Vale Studio, citing fraudulent misrepresentation. Furthermore, my legal team is demanding a complete, forensic accounting of every single dollar I have wired to this family over the past 7 years." Nolan scoffed, a desperate, wet sound escaping his throat. "You cannot just back out of a signed commercial contract, Caroline. They will laugh you out of court." "I do not need to fight you in court, Nolan," I replied smoothly, leaning forward just slightly, "because I am not here to negotiate a settlement, and I am certainly not asking for your permission to leave. I am just giving you a courtesy heads up." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of my family. A certified duplicate of this entire binder, including every bank statement, every forged timeline, and the undeniable proof of the amended corporate filings, was delivered via private courier yesterday afternoon. The commercial leasing company has it, the equipment lenders have it, and most importantly, The lead plaintiff attorney currently suing you for vendor fraud has it. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Elaine gasped sharply, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer, terrifying reality of the situation finally crashed through her thick wall of delusion. This was no longer a private family dispute she could easily control, spin, or suppress, with a few well-timed tears and emotional threats. The financial crimes had violently breached the secure walls of her perfectly curated house. The entire town of Ashby Ridge was about to read the exact, humiliating details of her extortion plot in the public court records. No, Caroline, please, Elaine begged, her voice instantly dropping the aggressive, defensive edge. She practically fell out of her dining chair, reaching across the table with violently trembling hands. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send those private files to outsiders. If this goes public, we will be completely ruined. We will be the laughingstock of the entire county. The church congregation will know. The neighbors will know. Please, sweetheart, do not destroy this family over a misunderstanding. I am begging you. Keep this between us. She was not begging for my forgiveness. She was begging for the exact same thing she had always valued far above my own well-being, her flawless public image. Before I could respond, my father stepped forward from the dark shadows of the hallway. The man who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, the man who had silently watched his own wife bleed my bank accounts dry, suddenly found his voice, but he did not ask for money to save the physical house. He did not ask for cash to help Sloane cover her debts. He looked at me with hollow, desperate eyes. Caroline, please listen to her, David pleaded, his voice cracking with the heavy, pathetic weight of a broken man. Your mother is absolutely right. If this goes to trial, if the whole town finds out what we did, I will never be able to show my face at the hardware store or the diner ever again. I will lose whatever tiny shred of dignity I have left in this community. Just withdraw the legal notices. We will figure out a way to pay you back quietly over time. Just give us the grace of your silence. I stared at the two of them. 7 years ago, I had sat in a boiling hot parking lot waiting for a text message, desperately praying that my parents would just show up and love me for exactly who I was. Today, they were finally standing right in front of me, practically on their knees, begging, but they were not begging for my love. They were begging for my silence. They were begging for my continued, quiet complicity in my own destruction. I stood up straight, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. I felt a profound, exhilarating lightness spreading rapidly through my chest. The heavy, invisible chains of guilt and toxic obligation I had dragged around for nearly a decade simply evaporated into thin air. No, I said, the single syllable echoing through the dining room with absolute finality. I am not doing this to be vindictive, and I am not doing this for revenge. I am doing this to permanently terminate my designated role as your living, breathing bank account. You made a conscious daily choice to exploit my loyalty. If you wanted to protect the pristine Hamilton family reputation, you should have thought about the severe consequences before you decided to build your extravagant lives with stolen money. The bank is officially closed. The vault is entirely empty, and the audience is finally seeing the real show. I did not wait for their response. I turned away from the table. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sloane. She was not crying for me to save her anymore. She had completely turned her back on our mother. She was staring directly at Nolan, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the glamorous, flawless life she had worshipped was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and it had just violently collapsed in front of 24 prominent witnesses. She was finally looking at her husband and seeing the exact same desperate fraud the rest of the world saw. Noah placed his hand firmly and protectively on the small of my back, guiding me away from the table and toward the front door. Behind us, the dining room erupted into absolute unfiltered chaos. The guests began whispering furiously to one another. Elaine wailed my name, her voice shrill and desperate, while my father tried uselessly to calm her down. Nolan began shouting rapid, aggressive excuses at a completely unresponsive Sloane. Caroline, Wait, please just listen to me, my mother shrieked from the hallway. I reached the heavy oak front door, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled it open. The cool, crisp Kentucky night air rushed into the suffocating house. I did not stop walking. I did not turn my head to look back at the wreckage. I had finally learned the most vital, hard-earned lesson of my life. True closure does not require an apology from the exact people who broke you. Some stories only reach their true conclusion when the victim simply refuses to stay in the room and listen to one more fabricated lie. We walked down the long concrete driveway, leaving the screaming and the pathetic pleading far behind us. The drive back to Chicago felt entirely different than the journey there. The oppressive, heavy tension of the morning had been completely replaced by the quiet, peaceful hum of the highway tires against the asphalt. I rested my head against the cool glass of the passenger window and watched the dark, rural landscape blur past, heading rapidly back toward the bright, towering skyline of the city I had conquered all on my own. The aftermath in Ashby Ridge was swift and remarkably merciless. Without my pristine credit score and endless cash flow acting as a human financial shield, Ivory Vale Studio drowned rapidly under the crushing weight of its own debt. The vendors sued successfully, the commercial landlord evicted them, and the business was aggressively dissolved within 6 short months. Sloane, forced to confront the harsh, undeniable reality of her fraudulent marriage, filed for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce. For the very first time in her pampered, sheltered life, she had to get a real corporate job and figure out how to stand on her own 2 feet without our mother constantly pulling the strings. David completely lost his convenient, lifelong shield of passive silence. The entire town knew exactly what he had cowardly allowed to happen, and the lingering, heavy shame forced him into a quiet, deeply isolated retirement. Elaine lost the one thing she valued more than oxygen itself, her absolute ability to control the narrative. The wealthy neighbors stopped inviting her to Sunday brunches. The church choir slowly pushed her out of the spotlight, and the flawless Hamilton family image she had ruthlessly maintained was permanently reduced to a pathetic cautionary tale of local gossip. As for me, I returned to my beautiful penthouse on the 32nd floor. I returned to my demanding, highly fulfilling career at Halcyon Risk Partners. I returned to the secure, peaceful life I had built with my own 2 hands, my own fierce discipline, and my own unshakable name. I was no longer the invisible, desperate daughter staring at 2 empty chairs in a crowded auditorium. I was the architect of my own reality, and I was finally the absolute, undisputed authority on exactly who was allowed to step foot into my life. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy family drama. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people.